Welcome. Find a comfortable position, let your breathing settle into a gentle rhythm, and prepare to journey backward through time. Tonight, we visit a place that once rivaled Rome itself, a city of merchants and mariners, of purple-dyed silks and stone harbors, of voices speaking a dozen languages in crowded marketplaces beneath the North African sun. Carthage. The name itself carries weight, heavy with the memory of wars and elephants crossing mountains, of fleets that commanded the Mediterranean, of a civilization that has largely vanished, leaving behind foundations and fragments, debates and mysteries. But before the destruction, before the final flames consumed the great city, there was daily life, ordinary people, rising with the dawn, working through the heat of midday, returning home as evening cooled the streets. You need not concentrate too carefully on what follows. Let the details wash over you, like waves against a harbor wall. Some will catch your attention, others will fade into the background, and that is exactly as it should be. We have time hours stretching ahead of us to explore this ancient world at a pace that asks nothing urgent of you. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine yourself stepping through a doorway in time, leaving behind the familiar comforts of the present, entering streets that knew different gods, different languages, different rhythms of existence. The past awaits, patient and unchanging, ready to receive you. Let us begin. The morning begins before true dawn, in the gray half-light that precedes the sun's arrival. You wake in your apartment, one of many stacked in a multi-story building near the commercial quarter, close enough to the harbors that you can hear even now in this quiet hour, the gentle lapping of water against stone, the occasional creak of ship, timbers settling in their berths. Your home is modest. The room you share with your family occupies a single floor in a building that rises perhaps 4 or 5 stories, its walls built of stone and brick, plastered and painted in faded ochre and white. The ceiling is low, the space efficient rather than generous. Wooden shutters cover the small window that faces the narrow street below. Through gaps in those shutters, the first hints of light are beginning to show. The floor beneath you is packed earth in some areas, stone tiles in others, where water might splash during cooking or washing. A small oil lamp, its wick barely flickering, provides the only light within. The scent of olive oil mingles with the earthier smell of wool blankets and the faint, ever-present trace of salt air that pervades everything in this coastal city. You rise carefully, mindful not to disturb those still sleeping. The rhythm of waking, dressing, beginning the day follows patterns worn smooth by repetition. Your clothing is simple, a tunic of undyed wool, practical and durable, the kind worn by thousands of others like you throughout the city. In cooler months, you might add a cloak. Today, you anticipate heat and keep your garments light. Outside your door, the common stairwell descends in darkness. Stone steps, worn in the center where countless feet have trodden, lead down past other doorways, other lives beginning their own morning routines. You can hear a baby crying somewhere above, the low murmur of voices, the scrape of pottery being moved about. Emerging onto the street, you enter a world already stirring toward wakefulness. The street itself is narrow, as most streets in Carthage are narrow, bounded by buildings that rise tall on either side, creating corridors of shadow even as the sky brightens overhead. The pavement beneath your feet is stone, fitted together with the kind of precision that speaks to civic organization, to a government that concerns itself with infrastructure and drainage. The drainage, in fact, is one of the marvels of Carthage, though you take it for granted, as one takes for granted the air one breathes. Beneath these streets runs a network of channels and pipes, carrying away wastewater, directing rainfall toward cisterns and away from dwellings. In other cities of this era, filth accumulates in streets, creating hazards and disease. Here, the engineering minds of Phoenician descendants have crafted something more civilized, more ordered. You walk with purpose, joining others emerging from their own doorways, all of you flowing like tributaries into a larger stream of humanity. The city is waking in earnest now. Shopkeepers are opening shutters, merchants are arranging goods for display, and the great symphony of urban life begins its daily performance. The languages you hear are a constant reminder of empire, of networks that span the Mediterranean and beyond. Punic, the language of Carthage itself, descended from Phoenician, fills most conversations, its Semitic rhythms and guttural consonants, the native tongue of the city. But listen more carefully. There, a group of laborers speaking Libyan, the indigenous language of North Africa, their presence evidence of populations absorbed into Carthaginian territory. Further along, the melodic cadences of Greek, spoken by merchants who have made this city their home, drawn by commerce and opportunity. And occasionally, the sounds of Iberian, brought by traders and settlers from Spain, where Carthage maintains colonies and mines rich with silver. This polyglot character defines Carthage in ways that even Rome, for all its eventual vastness, cannot quite match in this century. Carthage is fundamentally a trading city, a maritime power, a place where profit matters more than ethnic purity. If you can contribute to the city's wealth, if you can work, trade, produce, then you belong, regardless of where your ancestors were born. You turn a corner, and the street opens slightly, widening into a small square where a fountain provides water for the neighborhood. Already, people gather with vessels of clay and bronze, filling them for the day's needs. The fountain itself is a simple affair, but functional water flows from a bronze spout shaped like a lion's head, a nod to decorative sensibilities, even in practical infrastructure. Beyond the square, you enter the district where you work, where hundreds like you labor in the workshops that produce one of Carthage's most famous exports, purple-dyed cloth. The color purple, that deep, rich hue prized across the Mediterranean, comes from a laborious process involving sea snails, harvested by the thousands, their shells crushed and processed to extract tiny amounts of dye. The workshop where you spend your days is a long, low building with high windows to admit light and air. Inside, the space divides into different areas, each dedicated to a particular stage of production. You do not work with the precious purple dye itself, that is reserved for skilled artisans whose hands have learned the delicate chemistry of mordants and timing. Your labor is more fundamental, but no less necessary. You work with wool, preparing it for dyeing. The raw fleeces arrive from pastoral regions of North Africa and beyond, greasy with lanolin, matted and filthy. Your task, along with dozens of others, is to transform this raw material into something clean, aligned, ready to receive color. The work begins with washing. Large vats of water, heated over fires, receive the fleeces. You plunge them into the hot water, working them with wooden paddles, feeling the heat rise and steam around your face. The smell is distinctive wet wool, soap made from olive oil and lye, smoke from the fires below. It is not an unpleasant smell, merely pervasive, the kind that clings to your skin and clothes until you carry it home with you each evening. After washing comes combing, the tedious process of drawing the wool fibers through bronze combs, again and again, until they lie parallel and smooth. Your hands know this motion, have performed it thousands of times. The rhythmic pull, the slight resistance of the fibers, the gradual transformation from chaos to order, these become meditative in their repetition. Around you, others work at their own tasks. A woman nearby spins thread on a drop spindle, the weight rotating hypnotically as fiber becomes yarn. Further along, weavers work at upright looms, their fingers flying between threads with practiced efficiency. The workshop hums with quiet industry, punctuated by occasional conversation, brief exchanges about work or family or the price of bread in the markets. The overseer, a man who answers to the workshop's owner but rarely sees him, moves through the space periodically, checking progress, ensuring quality. He is not cruel, but neither is he particularly kind. He represents the interests of capital, of profit margins and delivery schedules. You are a means to an end, a necessary component in a larger economic machine. The purple dye itself, when it is applied, transforms fabric into luxury. The finest purple cloth from Carthage commands extraordinary prices in markets, from Greece to Egypt, from Sicily to the Atlantic coast. Royalty and priests, the wealthy and powerful, they adorn themselves in Tyrian purple. As it is called, named for Tyre, the Phoenician mother city from which Carthage itself was founded centuries ago. But you do not wear purple. Your tunic remains the natural color of wool, or perhaps dyed with cheaper substances, madder for red, woad for blue, saffron for yellow. Purple is for others, for those whose lives unfold in spaces you will never enter, whose concerns and luxuries exist as distant and abstract as foreign lands. Midday approaches, and with it comes a break in labor. The heat of the North African sun makes afternoon work sluggish, inefficient. Better to rest during the worst of it, to resume when the air begins to cool again. This pattern shapes the rhythm of your days: early rising, morning labor, midday pause, afternoon resumption, evening rest. You step out into streets now fully alive with activity. This is when Carthage truly reveals itself, when the population of 400,000 makes its presence felt in every square and marketplace, every harbor and temple precinct. Imagine for a moment the density of such a population compressed into the confines of a walled city. The press of bodies, the constant motion, the sheer human energy of so many lives intersecting. The markets draw you as they draw everyone seeking food for the day's main meal. Carthage's markets are abundant, fed by an empire that spans the western Mediterranean and beyond. Here, you find olives from groves in the fertile hinterland, fish caught that very morning in the Gulf, grain from Sicily or Sardinia, wine from Italian allies or Spanish colonies. The market stretches through several interconnected squares, covered in some areas with awnings that provide shade, open to the sky in others. Vendors call out in multiple languages, advertising their goods, negotiating prices. The air fills with competing scents: fresh bread, grilled fish, ripening fruit, spices from eastern lands, the earthier smells of vegetables still bearing soil from their harvesting. You move through the crowds with the ease of familiarity, knowing which vendors offer fair prices, which scales might tip slightly in the seller's favor, which fish are freshest based on the brightness of their eyes and the firmness of their flesh. You purchase bread, flat and round, still warm from the oven. You buy a small portion of salted fish, perhaps some olives, some onions, a handful of dates for sweetness. The coins you hand over are small, bronze, stamped with images that speak to Carthage's identity: the head of Tanit, the chief goddess, or symbols of maritime power like ships or horses. The exchange is brief, practiced, one transaction among thousands occurring simultaneously throughout these markets. Beyond the food vendors, other markets specialize in different goods. There are areas for pottery, where vessels of every size and purpose await purchase. Markets for cloth and clothing, for leather goods, for metalwork, bronze tools, iron implements, precious gold and silver for those who can afford such luxuries. There are slave markets too, a reality of this ancient world that you pass without particular thought, for slavery is woven into the fabric of civilization as you know it, a practice so common as to seem natural, inevitable. The slaves you see represent the diversity of Carthage's rich Libyans from the interior, prisoners from wars in Sicily or Iberia, Greeks fallen into debt or misfortune, even occasionally people from lands so distant they speak tongues no one recognizes. They stand or sit in designated areas, awaiting purchase, their futures uncertain, their humanity reduced to economic value. You do not linger in such places. Your own status, while far from privileged, at least includes freedom, the ability to sell your labor rather than your person. It is a distinction that matters, though the gap between poor freeman and slave is sometimes narrower than comfort allows. As afternoon begins to cool into evening, you return to the workshop for the day's final hours of labor. The light through the high windows takes on a golden quality, softer and more forgiving than the harsh brilliance of midday. Your hands return to their tasks, to the familiar motions that require little conscious thought, allowing your mind to wander. You think about the festival approaching, a celebration honoring Tanit and Baal-Hamon, the chief deities of Carthage. The city's religious life punctuates the calendar with observances, some grand and public, others small and domestic. Tanit, the goddess associated with fertility, the moon, and protection, receives particular devotion. Her symbol, a triangle topped with a horizontal bar and a circle, appears throughout the city, on amulets, on monuments, on temple walls. Baal-Hamon, the chief male deity, stands as her consort, associated with fertility and vegetation, with the power to bless or curse the land's productivity. Together, they form the spiritual center around which Carthaginian religious practice revolves. The festivals in their honor bring the city together in ways that daily life, with its divisions of class and occupation, normally prevents. There will be processions, sacrifices of animals at the great temples, distributions of food, music, and dancing in the streets. For a day, the relentless machinery of commerce pauses, and Carthage remembers that it is not merely an economic engine, but a community with shared beliefs and traditions. The question of children's sacrifices, of offerings to Moloch, these are matters that will be debated and examined in later times, their truth obscured by propaganda and archaeological interpretation. For now, in your present moment, you know only what your culture teaches, that the gods require offerings, that devotion takes many forms, that the relationship between human and divine follows patterns established long ago. As evening deepens and the workshop finally releases you for the day, you join the flow of workers heading home. The streets take on a different character as darkness approaches. Oil lamps begin to glow in windows, creating patterns of light and shadow. The temperature drops slightly, offering relief after the day's heat. You might stop at a tavern, a simple establishment where wine flows cheap and conversation flows cheaper still. Here, men like yourself gather after labor, sharing news and gossip, complaints about overseers, and pride in work well done. The wine is cut with water, as is customary, enough to ease the day's tensions without inducing complete intoxication. The talk tonight turns to politics, as it often does. Carthage is governed by a complex system that balances different interests and powers. There is a senate of several hundred members, drawn from the city's merchant and landowning elite. There are 2 chief magistrates, called Sophites, elected annually, who wield executive authority. There is a council of elders, particularly influential in matters of war and peace. And there is, at least in theory, a popular assembly where citizens can vote on certain matters, though its real power is limited. You, as a common laborer, have little direct voice in these institutions. The oligarchy that rules Carthage represents wealth, not the broader population. Decisions about war and peace, about trade agreements and colonial expansion, about taxation and public works, these are made by men whose lives differ from yours, as much as land differs from sea. Still, the decisions affect you. The taxes you pay support the state's operations, its fleet, its mercenary armies, its diplomatic missions. Carthage, unlike Rome with its citizen legions, prefers to hire military force rather than demand it from its population. This is consistent with the city's commercial character. Everything, even war, can be reduced to a transaction, a matter of finding the right price for the right service. The mercenaries who fight for Carthage come from everywhere: Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Greeks, even Italians sometimes. They are professionals, men for whom war is a trade like any other. This system has advantages. It allows Carthage to focus its own population on commerce and production. But it has disadvantages too, as will become apparent in the great struggle with Rome that approaches, when loyalty purchased with gold proves less reliable than loyalty born of shared identity. But those troubles lie in the future. Tonight, The wine is tolerable, the company familiar, and the day's labor is done. You finish your cup, settle your small debt, and make your way through darkening streets toward home. The night watch is already about their rounds, men tasked with maintaining order after dark, carrying torches and clubs, their presence both reassuring and vaguely threatening. Crime exists in Carthage, as it exists in all cities: theft, violence, disputes that escalate beyond words. The watch serves as deterrent and response, though their effectiveness varies by district and by the wealth of its inhabitants. Reaching your building, you climb the familiar stairs in near total darkness, your feet finding the steps through memory rather than sight. The door to your apartment opens, and inside, by the light of a single lamp, your family awaits. There is food, simple but sufficient: the bread and fish you purchased, perhaps supplemented with lentils or beans prepared by your wife during the day. You eat without much conversation. The hour is late, and tomorrow will bring another early rising, another day of labor. Children sleep in the corner, bundled in blankets, their breathing soft and regular. The sounds of the city continue outside: distant voices, footsteps, the occasional bark of a dog, the ever-present background whisper of the sea. Before sleep, you might step to the small household shrine, no more than a niche in the wall where figurines of the gods reside. A small offering, a portion of bread, a splash of wine, acknowledges their presence, seeks their blessing. The ritual is brief, perfunctory perhaps, but it connects you to traditions that stretch back centuries, to the original Phoenician settlers who founded this city, to practices that define what it means to be Carthaginian. You lie down on your sleeping mat, pulling a wool blanket over yourself against the night's relative coolness. Through the window shutters, you can see a slice of star-filled sky, the same stars that guide Carthaginian ships across the Mediterranean, that have witnessed the rise of this great city from modest trading post to empire. Sleep comes gradually, as the body's exhaustion overcomes the mind's lingering thoughts. Tomorrow will be much like today, and the day after much like tomorrow. The rhythm of your life follows patterns as old as civilization itself: work and rest, effort and reward, the endless cycle of days and seasons, years and generations. You are one person among 400,000, one life in a vast urban tapestry, your individual existence barely registering in the grand sweep of history. Yet you are also the foundation upon which the city rests, the labor that produces its wealth, the population that fills its streets and markets, that worships at its temples and pays its taxes, that makes Carthage possible. In your own small way, you are Carthage. And Carthage, for now, for this moment in the 3rd century before the Common Era, is the greatest city in the Western Mediterranean, a power that even Rome must reckon with, a civilization that has mastered the sea and turned trade into empire. But civilizations, like individual lives, follow arcs that include both rise and fall. The purple-dyed cloth you help produce, the ships harbored in the great circular ports, the sophisticated infrastructure and diverse population, all of it rests on foundations that time will test, that conflict will challenge, that history will ultimately transform beyond recognition. For now, though, you sleep. The present moment, this particular night in this particular life, asks nothing more of you than rest, than the body's restoration, than dreams that may carry you far from these narrow streets and modest rooms, or may simply dissolve into the darkness of unconsciousness, peaceful and undisturbed. The city sleeps around you, its 400,000 souls finding what rest they can, what comfort exists in familiar spaces and familiar routines. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over the North African coast, casting light on harbors and temples, marketplaces and workshops, on the great endeavor of human civilization in all its complexity and contradiction. But tomorrow can wait. For now, there is only the quiet darkness, the soft rhythm of breathing, the gradual descent into sleep's embrace. Let yourself drift with it, this ancient commoner returning to dreams, this small life in a great city, this moment preserved in time, waiting patiently through centuries to be remembered, to be imagined, to offer comfort and context to those who come after, who seek to understand not just the grand events of history, but the daily rhythms, the ordinary experiences, the texture of life as it was actually lived. Rest now. The past asks nothing of you but attention, and even that, only as much as you wish to give. Let the details settle like sediment, some catching in memory, others drifting away into forgetting. There is no test to pass, no urgent lesson to learn. There is only the slow exploration of another time, another place, another way of being human in the world. Sleep comes. The streets of ancient Carthage fade into the darkness behind your closed eyes. The rhythm of your breathing synchronizes with the rhythm of waves against stone harbors, the eternal pulse of the Mediterranean against Africa's shore. And in that rhythm, in that steady, unchanging pattern, there is peace. The morning streets fade into memory now, and time shifts forward slightly, carrying us into the years when Carthage's destiny intersected with Rome's in ways that would reshape the Mediterranean world. The rhythm of daily life continued. Of course, people still woke and worked, still bought bread in markets, and returned home at evening. But over it all hung the shadow of conflict, the knowledge that far away, in places with unfamiliar names, decisions were being made that would determine whether Carthage remained a power or became a memory. Let us step back for a moment to understand how these two great cities came to such enmity. Rome and Carthage had coexisted for centuries, their interests occasionally overlapping, but not fundamentally conflicting. Rome focused on land, on the gradual conquest of the Italian peninsula. Carthage focused on sea, on trade routes and coastal colonies. There was space enough, it seemed, for both. But Sicily changed everything. That large island, positioned between Italy and North Africa, commanded the central Mediterranean. Both powers saw strategic value. Both sought influence over its cities and harbors. The First Punic War, lasting from 264 to 241 BCE, began as a dispute over Sicilian territory and evolved into a prolonged naval struggle that tested both civilizations to their limits. Carthage lost that war. The defeat was not catastrophic. The city remained intact. Its trade continued. Its wealth persisted. But Sicily was gone, ceded to Rome. And shortly after, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica as well, taking advantage of Carthage's internal difficulties to expand its own domain. The humiliation stung. The indemnity payments imposed by Rome drained resources. And in the corridors of power in Carthage, men began to think about restoration, about recovering what had been lost, about revenge. Among those men was Hamilcar Barca, a general who had distinguished himself in the First Punic War, who had kept Carthaginian resistance alive in Sicily, even as the war turned against his city. Hamilcar looked westward, toward Iberia, Spain, seeing opportunity in its silver mines and its warrior tribes. With Carthage's blessing, he led expeditions to expand Carthaginian control in that land, building not just an empire, but a power base, a family dynasty devoted to the struggle against Rome. Hamilcar died in battle in 228 BCE, but his legacy passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and then, in 221 BCE, to his son. The son was 26 years old when he assumed command of Carthaginian forces in Spain. His name was Hannibal. Imagine Hannibal for a moment, not as the legendary figure he would become, but as a young man inheriting enormous responsibility. He had been raised on stories of Carthaginian glory, had been brought to Spain as a child, had witnessed his father's campaigns, and absorbed his father's hatred of Rome. Ancient sources claim that Hamilcar made young Hannibal swear an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome, though whether this literally occurred or represents later embellishment, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that Hannibal possessed qualities that made him formidable strategic brilliance, charismatic leadership, audacity that bordered on recklessness, and a capacity for endurance that sustained him through years of hardship. He understood that Carthage could not defeat Rome in a conventional war, could not match Rome's vast manpower or its ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. He needed something different, something unexpected. The spark that ignited the Second Punic War came in 219 BCE, when Hannibal besieged and captured Saguntum, a city in Spain allied with Rome. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage's government, dominated by the Barcid family's influence and resentful of Roman arrogance, refused. War followed, inevitable as sunrise. But Hannibal did not wait for Rome to bring war to Carthage. Instead, in the spring of 218 BCE, he launched an expedition that would become legendary, an undertaking so audacious that even now, millennia later, it captures imagination and disbelief. He marched on Rome itself, not by sea, where Rome now possessed naval strength, but by land, through southern Gaul and over the Alps, bringing war to Italy's doorstep when Rome expected to fight in Spain or Africa. The army that departed from New Carthage, Carthago Nova, in modern Spain, numbered perhaps 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and approximately 37 war elephants. These elephants, likely a North African species, smaller than their modern relatives, served multiple purposes: shock troops in battle, beasts of burden, and psychological weapons that terrified enemies unfamiliar with such creatures. Imagine yourself not as a general surveying strategy, but as an ordinary soldier in that vast column, one among thousands, your identity submerged in the collective endeavor. Perhaps you are Libyan, recruited from Carthage's African territories, equipped with spear and shield, your skin darkened by years under the Mediterranean sun. Or perhaps you are Iberian, a warrior from the Spanish tribes allied to Carthage, fighting for pay and plunder and the glory of distant campaigns. The days settle into rhythm wake. Eat a simple meal of grain porridge or bread. Break camp, march. The landscape changes gradually as you move north and east. The terrain becomes less familiar, the languages spoken by local inhabitants increasingly strange. You cross rivers, some by ford, others by boat or improvised bridges. You pass through settlements where Gallic tribes watch with suspicion, or curiosity, or calculation, wondering whether to aid, oppose, or simply let pass this foreign army moving through their lands. The Rhone River presents a significant obstacle, its waters wide and swift. Hannibal negotiates with local tribes for boats and assistance. The crossing takes several days, complicated by hostile tribes on the far bank. The elephants prove particularly difficult. These massive creatures, accustomed to solid ground, resist entering the water. Eventually, they are coaxed or forced across on rafts, some swimming, their trumpeting cries echoing across the water, a sound unlike any the natural world of this region typically produces. And then, after the Rhone, comes the greater challenge still. The Alps rise before the army like a wall, their peaks white with snow even in late summer, their passes narrow and treacherous, their heights home to tribes who regard any intruders as enemies and opportunities for plunder. The ascent begins. The path, such as it is, winds upward through increasingly rocky terrain. The air grows thinner, colder. Soldiers accustomed to Mediterranean warmth now shiver in wool cloaks insufficient against mountain chill. The column stretches for miles, vulnerable, unable to concentrate its strength in these narrow confines. The tribes descend upon the army at its most vulnerable points, where the path narrows, where sheer drops make maneuvering impossible, where a few defenders can hold off vastly superior numbers. They roll boulders down onto the Carthaginian column, creating chaos among pack animals and soldiers alike. They launch ambushes from high ground, hurling javelins and rocks before melting away into terrain they know intimately. Men die, not in glorious battle, but in confused skirmishes, or simply from falls when paths crumble beneath them, when pack animals stumble and drag their handlers over cliffs, when exhaustion and cold overcome those whose strength finally fails. The elephants, those magnificent beasts, suffer terribly. Some perish from the cold, others from falls, others from simple inability to continue. By the time the army emerges into Italy, only a fraction of the original elephant contingent remains. The high passes bring snow, even though the calendar has barely turned to autumn. Soldiers wrap cloth around their feet, struggle through drifts that reach their knees or higher. Visibility vanishes in storms that sweep across the peaks without warning. Men become separated from their units, lost in white blindness, their voices calling out and receiving only wind as answer. Food runs short. The high mountains offer little forage for animals, little game to hunt. Supplies carried from lower elevations dwindle. Hunger becomes a constant companion, a gnawing presence that weakens resolve along with bodies. The descent proves as difficult as the ascent. Fresh snow has fallen on ice from earlier storms, creating surfaces treacherously slippery. Soldiers slide and fall, some suffering broken bones, others more serious injuries. At one point, ancient sources tell us, a landslide blocks the path entirely, forcing Hannibal to order his engineers to clear a way through solid rock, using fire and vinegar heating the stone and then cooling it rapidly to create fractures, though modern historians debate the accuracy of this account. 15 days after beginning the Alpine crossing, the army emerges into the Po Valley in northern Italy, but the force that descends from those mountains is drastically reduced. Of the 90,000 infantry who began the journey, perhaps 50,000 remain. Of 12,000 cavalry, perhaps 9,000. The elephants number fewer than a dozen, and most of those will die in the coming months from lingering effects of the crossing. Yet despite these losses, despite the exhaustion and hunger and trauma of the march, Hannibal has achieved something remarkable. He has brought an army into Italy when Rome expected to fight in distant theaters. He has demonstrated that Rome's homeland is vulnerable, and he has immediately begun recruiting allies from among the Gallic tribes of northern Italy, who resent Roman expansion into their territories and welcome a powerful enemy of Rome as potential liberator. The first battle comes swiftly. At the Ticinus River in late November 18 BCE, it is primarily a cavalry engagement, a skirmish really, but psychologically important. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry light horsemen from North Africa, masters of mobile warfare, defeat their Roman counterparts. Among the wounded in this engagement is the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the man who will eventually defeat Hannibal, though that outcome lies years in the future. December brings a larger battle at the Trebia River. Here, Hannibal demonstrates the tactical genius that will characterize his Italian campaign. He lures the Roman army into battle under unfavorable conditions. The day is cold. The Romans have crossed an icy river before engaging. They are hungry and partially numb, while Hannibal's troops have eaten and warmed themselves. Moreover, Hannibal has hidden 2,000 men in ambush, and when battle is fully joined, they emerge from concealment to strike the Roman flanks and rear. The result is devastating for Rome. Of 4 Roman legions engaged, totaling perhaps 40,000 men, only about 10,000 escape in good order. The rest are killed or captured. Bodies litter the battlefield, their blood staining the winter ground. Their lives ended far from home in service to a republic that promised victory but delivered only death. Imagine yourself among the survivors of that battle, a Roman legionary who has somehow escaped the slaughter. You stumble through winter landscape, separated from your unit, hoping to reach safety before Carthaginian cavalry hunts you down, or cold and hunger claim what the enemy's swords did not. The memory of the battle haunts you, the moment when you realized the line was breaking, when retreat became rout, when every man fought only for his own survival. The faces of comrades who fell, the sounds of the wounded calling for help that would not come, the weight of shield and sword that seemed to increase with each exhausted step. Rome receives news of the disaster with shock, but not despair. The Senate mobilizes new legions, calls up reserves, appoints new commanders. Rome's strength lies not in individual battles, but in systemic resilience, in the ability to lose and continue, to absorb defeats that would destroy other states, and simply raise new armies. Winter provides a pause. Hannibal establishes his army in northern Italy, recovering from the Alpine crossing, training new recruits, planning the next season's campaign. His soldiers settle into winter quarters, finding what comfort exists in temporary shelters, in the simple fact of surviving to see another spring. That spring, in June 217 BCE, brings the next major engagement at Lake Trasimene in central Italy. Here, Hannibal again employs deception and terrain to maximum advantage. He lures the Roman army, commanded by the consul Gaius Flaminius, into a narrow plain beside the lake, enclosed by hills where Hannibal has hidden much of his force during the night. Morning dawns foggy, visibility limited. The Roman column advances along the lakeshore, unaware of danger. Then, from the hills, Hannibal's troops descend in a coordinated ambush. The Romans, caught completely by surprise, compressed into a narrow space with the lake on one side and attacking enemies on the other, have no room to deploy properly, no ability to form the organized lines that make Roman legions formidable. The battle, if it can even be called a battle rather than a massacre, lasts perhaps 3 hours. 15,000 Romans die. Flaminius himself falls in the fighting. Another 15,000 are captured. Only a small portion of the army escapes. Many Romans, pressed toward the lake by attacking Carthaginians, attempt to swim to safety, still wearing armor. The weight drags them down into the water's depths, where they drown in the fog-shrouded morning, their struggles gradually ceasing, their bodies sinking into the lake's cold embrace. The news reaches Rome of another catastrophic defeat. The city's mood darkens. For the first time in living memory, an enemy army operates freely in Italy, seemingly able to defeat Roman legions at will. Traditional Roman confidence, the assumption of eventual victory that has characterized the Republic's wars, begins to erode. In response, Rome takes an extraordinary step. The Senate appoints a dictator a temporary position of supreme authority granted in times of crisis. The man chosen is Quintus Fabius Maximus, and his strategy will earn him the nickname Cunctator, the Delayer. Fabius understands what others are beginning to grasp, that Hannibal cannot be met in pitched battle, that his tactical brilliance and superior cavalry make such confrontations disastrous for Rome. Instead, Fabius adopts a strategy of avoidance and attrition. He shadows Hannibal's army with a Roman force, but refuses battle. He harasses Carthaginian foragers, attacks small detachments, denies Hannibal the decisive engagement he seeks. He evacuates civilians and destroys crops in Hannibal's path, creating a wasteland that offers nothing to sustain the invading army. The strategy is sound but unpopular. Roman pride chafes at the appearance of cowardice, at an army that refuses to fight. Political opposition to Fabius grows. His term as dictator expires, and in 216 BCE, the consulship passes to men who promise a more aggressive approach: Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Rome mobilizes its largest army yet, perhaps 87,000 men, an unprecedented concentration of force. The strategy is simple: find Hannibal, engage him with overwhelming numbers, crush his smaller army through sheer weight of men and iron. The armies meet in August 216 BCE, near the town of Cani in southeastern Italy. The battle that follows will be studied by military theorists for millennia, a masterpiece of tactical envelopment, a demonstration of how smaller forces with superior leadership can destroy much larger ones. Hannibal positions his infantry in a crescent formation, with Gauls and Iberians in the center, his more reliable African infantry on the flanks, his cavalry positions on both wings. The Romans deploy in traditional manner, their infantry in deep, dense formations designed to punch through enemy lines by sheer momentum. The battle begins. The Roman infantry advances, crashes into Hannibal's center, begins to push it backward. This is exactly what Hannibal planned. As his center bends and retreats, forming an increasingly concave line, the Roman legions press forward eagerly, sensing victory, plunging deeper into what is actually a trap. Meanwhile, on both flanks, Carthaginian cavalry defeats its Roman counterparts and wheels inward. The African infantry on Hannibal's flanks advances, pivoting to strike the Roman legions from both sides. The Carthaginian center, having retreated as far as planned, now holds position. The Romans suddenly realize their situation surrounded on all sides, compressed together so tightly that individual soldiers can barely move their weapon arms, unable to maneuver or retreat, unable to bring their numerical superiority to bear, because only those on the outside of their formation can actually fight. What follows is slaughter on a scale almost unimaginable. The battle lasts hours, the sun moving across the sky while below, men kill and die in circumstances of nightmare. The press of bodies becomes so tight that men die standing up, held upright by the compression of the crowd. The ground becomes slick with blood, making footing treacherous. The air fills with screams and the metal clash of weapons, with the smell of open bodies and released bowels, with heat and terror and the desperate instinct to survive. 50,000 Romans die at Cannae. 50,000 men whose lives end in a single afternoon, whose final moments are consumed by violence and fear, whose bodies will be left on the field because there are simply too many to bury properly. The consul Paulus dies fighting. 80 senators or men of senatorial rank perish. Thousands more are captured, to be sold into slavery or held for ransom that often never comes. It is Rome's worst military disaster, perhaps the worst single-day loss of any ancient army in recorded history. News of Cannae reaches Rome with the weight of apocalypse. The Republic seems to teeter on the edge of collapse. Surely now, allies will desert. Surely now, Rome will sue for peace, accept Hannibal's terms, acknowledge defeat. But Rome does not surrender. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Second Punic War Roman refusal to accept defeat even after catastrophic losses. The Senate meets, takes measures to raise new armies, forbids even discussion of peace. Women sell their jewelry to fund the war effort. Slaves are promised freedom in exchange for military service. The entire society mobilizes with grim determination. And Hannibal, despite his brilliant victory, cannot capitalize on it fully. He lacks siege equipment to attack Rome itself, lacks the manpower to storm such a large, well-defended city. He continues to campaign in Italy, winning battles, capturing cities, seeking to break Rome's confederation of allies, but the decisive blow eludes him. Years pass. The war settles into a pattern of Carthaginian tactical superiority, but strategic stalemate. Hannibal's army remains undefeated in pitched battle, but cannot force Rome to surrender. Rome continues to lose battles, but refuses to lose the war. In Spain, Roman armies under the Scipio family achieve successes against Carthaginian forces, gradually conquering the territory that serves as Hannibal's base and supplies. Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, eventually leads a relief army over the Alps to join Hannibal in Italy. But in 207 BCE, at the Metaurus River, Roman forces intercept and defeat this army. Hasdrubal dies in the battle. His severed head is thrown into Hannibal's camp, a grim message about the fate of Carthaginian relief efforts. By 204 BCE, the situation has shifted dramatically. Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the consul, wounded at Ticinus. A man who survived Cannae as a young military tribune has conquered Spain and been elected consul. He proposes an audacious strategy: invade Africa, attack Carthage itself, force Hannibal to abandon Italy to defend his homeland. Rome approves the plan. Scipio lands in North Africa with an army and immediately begins campaigning. He defeats Carthaginian forces in the field, wins allies among North African kingdoms, threatens Carthage directly. The Carthaginian government, finally feeling existential threat, recalls Hannibal from Italy. In 203 BCE, after 15 years in Italy, 15 years of continuous campaign, of victories that led nowhere, of watching the war slip away despite never losing a major battle. Hannibal boarded ships for Africa. One imagines his thoughts during that voyage. He leaves behind the land he invaded with such confidence, the battlefields where he demonstrated genius, the cause to which he devoted the prime years of his life. He returns to defend a city he barely knows as an adult, against an enemy it has learned from its defeats and grown stronger through adversity. The final confrontation comes in October 202 BCE at Zama, southwest of Carthage. Hannibal commands perhaps 45,000 men, including war elephants acquired in Africa. Scipio commands a similar number, with the crucial addition of Numidian cavalry led by Massinissa, a North African king who is allied with Rome. The battle begins with Hannibal's elephants charging the Roman lines, but Scipio has prepared for this. His troops open lanes through their formation, allowing the elephants to pass through harmlessly, or actively drive them back into Carthaginian lines, where they create chaos among friendly forces. The infantry engagement that follows is hard-fought and close, but the decisive moment comes when the cavalry returns. Scipio's Numidian and Roman horsemen, having driven off Carthaginian cavalry, wheel back to strike Hannibal's infantry from behind, replicating the envelopment tactic that Hannibal himself perfected at Cannae. This time, it is Carthaginian soldiers who find themselves surrounded, who fight and die in circumstances that offer no hope of victory. 20,000 Carthaginians perish. 20,000 men who marched to Zama expecting to save their city, who placed faith in Hannibal's reputation and experience, who learned that even genius cannot overcome material disadvantage and strategic exhaustion. Hannibal escapes the field with a remnant of his army. He rides to Carthage, and in a meeting with the city's leaders, delivers his counsel: sue for peace. Carthage has lost. Continued resistance will only bring destruction. The peace terms are harsh. Carthage must surrender all territories outside Africa. The fleet must be reduced to just 10 ships. War elephants must be handed over. A massive indemnity must be paid over 50 years. And perhaps most crushing, Carthage may not wage war without Rome's permission. These terms reduce Carthage from great power to client state, from maritime empire to regional city, from rival to subordinate. But they allow Carthage to survive, to retain independence, if not prestige, to continue existing rather than face the total destruction that will eventually come in the Third Punic War half a century later. From your position of rest, millennia later, you can observe these events with the detachment that time provides. The passions that drove these conflicts, pride, ambition, revenge, survival remain recognizable as human motivations, but their urgency has long since dissipated. What remains are the patterns, the rhythms of rise and fall, of brilliance and tragedy, of how even the most gifted individuals operate within constraints that ultimately determine outcomes regardless of talent. The Second Punic War reshaped the Mediterranean world. Rome emerged as the dominant power, its victory establishing foundations for eventual empire. Carthage survived but diminished, its energies turned inward, its days numbered. And the soldiers who fought Roman and Carthaginian, Numidian and Gallic, Iberian and Greek, they lived and died according to decisions made by distant leaders, their individual stories mostly lost, their collective sacrifice remembered only in outline. Sleep comes easily now, as it should, as these distant conflicts and ancient names blur together, as the specifics fade into general impressions of armies moving across landscapes, of battles won and lost, of a war that lasted 17 years and changed everything while leaving so much fundamentally the same. The past releases you, asks nothing more than acknowledgement. Rest in the knowledge that their struggles are long over, that the outcomes are settled, that history has moved on in its inexorable way, leaving behind only stories and lessons for those who come after. We shift now from the certainties of military history dates and battles, marshes and treaties into murkier territory, where evidence is fragmentary and interpretation contested. Here, In the realm of archaeology and ancient accusation, absolute answers dissolve into probabilities and competing theories. The very uncertainty invites a kind of contemplative calm, a recognition that not all questions from the past can be resolved with confidence. In the ruins of ancient Carthage, and in other Phoenician and Punic sites across the Mediterranean, archaeologists have discovered places called tophets. The word itself comes from Hebrew scripture, referring to a location in the valley of Hinnom, near Jerusalem, where, according to biblical texts, children were sacrificed to the god Moloch. Whether this biblical tophet actually existed as described, or whether the name represents later religious polemic, remains debated. But the term has been applied to certain Carthaginian sacred precincts, and with that application comes a freight of dark implication. Imagine yourself standing at such a site, not in ancient times, but in the present moment of archaeological discovery. The location is near the coast, within view of the harbors where Carthaginian ships once crowded. The ground has been carefully excavated, revealing layers of history compressed into earth and stone. What emerges from this patient work is both fascinating and disturbing. Thousands upon thousands of urns, small vessels of pottery or sometimes stone, each containing cremated remains. The urns are buried in defined areas, organized with clear intent. Markers stand above many of them stone steely, carved with dedications, with symbols, with names and brief inscriptions. The symbols repeat across hundreds of markers. The sign of Tanit, that distinctive triangle topped with a horizontal bar and circle. Representations of the crescent moon. Occasional images of priests or worshippers with raised hands. The inscriptions, when they can be read for Punic script, descended from Phoenician, is understood by scholars, though examples remain limited speak of offerings and vows. They mention Baal Hamon and Tanit. They use formulaic language about fulfilling promises, about giving what was pledged. But they are frustratingly vague about specifics, about exactly what is being offered, about the circumstances that prompted the dedication. And inside the urns, found again and again across thousands of examples, are the cremated bones of infants and very young children. Sometimes the remains of small animals, lambs, kids, birds appear instead, or mixed with human remains. The bones show evidence of burning at high temperatures, consistent with cremation. The age of the children, when forensic analysis can determine it, ranges from newborns to approximately 3 or 4 years old, with the majority being very young infants, including many who appear to have been stillborn or died at or shortly after birth. These are the facts, the observable evidence that archaeology provides. But from these facts, dramatically different interpretations emerge, and the debate that has consumed scholarship for over a century continues without definitive resolution. The first interpretation, the one that dominated understanding for most of the modern era, accepts ancient accusations at face value. Greek and Roman writers, particularly during and after the Punic Wars, described Carthaginian practice of child sacrifice in lurid terms. They claimed that Carthaginians, in times of crisis, or to fulfill religious obligations, would sacrifice their own children to Baal Hamon and Tanit, burning them alive in the arms of bronze statues, their cries drowned out by drums and music. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes events he claims occurred in 310 BCE, when Carthage faced military threat. There was in their city a bronze image of Cronus extending its hands, palms up and sloping toward the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. The Roman poet Ennius refers to the practice. Plutarch mentions it. The Christian writer Tertullian, himself from North Africa, describes it as something that continued even into his own era, though by then supposedly suppressed by Roman authorities. These sources, separated by time and culture from Carthage itself, agree on the basic accusation: Carthaginians sacrificed children. For scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries, discovering the tophets seemed to confirm these ancient accounts. Here was physical evidence burned infant remains, thousands of them, in a sacred precinct with religious dedications. What else could this be but the archaeological trace of the very practice ancient writers described? But gradually, alternative interpretations emerged, driven by more careful analysis of the evidence and by increased skepticism about ancient sources. Consider the context of those Greek and Roman writers. They were enemies of Carthage, or wrote during or after periods of conflict, or belonged to cultures seeking to justify their own actions by portraying their opponents as barbaric. The accusations of child sacrifice served propaganda purposes. They marked Carthaginians as other, as morally inferior, as deserving of conquest and destruction. Moreover, the accusations fit patterns of how ancient peoples stereotyped enemies and foreign cultures. Greeks and Romans regularly accused outsiders of the most shocking practices: cannibalism, incest, human sacrifice. These accusations established cultural boundaries, reinforced the accuser's sense of superiority, and provided moral justification for violence against the accused. When we examine the physical evidence more carefully, complexities emerge that challenge the simple sacrifice narrative. The infant mortality rate in the ancient world was extraordinarily high. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before age 5, with the highest mortality in the first year of life, and especially in the first weeks and days. Stillbirths, premature births, deaths from disease and malnutrition, these were tragically common experiences for ancient families. If the Tophets represent burial grounds for infants who died naturally, rather than sacrificial sites, their existence makes perfect sense. Many ancient cultures treated infant burials differently from adult burials, recognizing that beings who died before fully entering social life occupied a liminal status. Separate burial grounds for infants appear in various Mediterranean cultures. The Carthaginian Tophets might simply represent this practice, with the religious dedications reflecting parents' grief and their desire to place deceased children under divine protection. The presence of animal remains in some urns supports this interpretation. Ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures practiced animal sacrifice as substitution for human offerings, or as independent votive gifts. The mixing of animal and human remains in Tophets might indicate cases where families, unable to afford elaborate human burial or following particular traditions, offered animals alongside or instead of human remains. The inscriptions themselves, when examined closely, never explicitly state that children were sacrificed. They speak of offerings and fulfilling vows, but this language could apply to dedicating a deceased child to the gods after natural death, or to offering animals in hope of divine favor. The very vagueness that allows interpretation as sacrifice equally allows interpretation as commemoration. Some scholars have analyzed the bone remains themselves with increasing sophistication. Studies suggest that many of the infants were stillborn or died within days of birth timing that makes deliberate sacrifice less likely than natural mortality. Why would a culture systematically sacrifice newborns and stillbirths when infant mortality already provided such deaths without deliberate action? Yet the counter-argument persists. Other studies of the same bone evidence conclude that at least some of the children were several months to several years old enough that their deaths would not easily be attributable to perinatal causes. The sheer number of burials in some Tophets, accumulated over centuries, but still representing thousands of infant deaths in contexts clearly separated from regular cemeteries, seems statistically anomalous if only natural mortality is involved. The ancient sources, despite their biases, are numerous and consistent in their basic claims across different authors and time periods. Complete fabrication would require a remarkable level of coordinated invention. Even accounting for propaganda and exaggeration, the persistence of the accusation across multiple independent sources suggests some underlying reality, however distorted by hostile interpretation. And there are biblical parallels that cannot be entirely dismissed. Hebrew scriptures repeatedly condemn the practice of child sacrifice among neighboring Semitic peoples. suggesting that some form of the practice existed in the broader cultural region from which Phoenician civilization, and thus Carthaginian culture, emerged. The god Moloch mentioned in biblical prohibitions may be connected to the title Melech, king, applied to Baal. The biblical Tophet in the Valley of Hinnom shares too many similarities with the Carthaginian sites to dismiss the connection entirely. Recent archaeological work has added further complexity. Examination of the site at Carthage itself, the largest known Tophet, reveals that the area served as a sanctuary for several centuries, with continuous use and expansion. The organization of the burials, the standardization of certain practices, the investment in stone markers, all of this suggests systematic, institutionalized behavior rather than ad hoc responses to random infant deaths. Some researchers have proposed middle ground interpretations. Perhaps the Tophet served multiple functions, primarily as burial grounds for children who died naturally, but occasionally as sites where children were deliberately sacrificed in extreme circumstances, during military crises or moments of collective desperation. This would reconcile the archaeological evidence of high infant mortality with the ancient accounts of occasional sacrificial practice. Or perhaps the practice evolved over time, beginning as genuine child sacrifice in earlier Phoenician contexts, gradually transforming into symbolic substitution where animals replaced children, while the religious language and rituals preserved archaic forms that later Greek and Roman observers misinterpreted as describing current practice. The truth, if we are honest with ourselves, remains elusive. The evidence allows multiple interpretations, and the interpretation we favor often reveals as much about our own assumptions and biases as it does about ancient reality. Modern scholars, uncomfortable with the idea of systematic child sacrifice by a sophisticated civilization, may prefer explanations that avoid such disturbing conclusions. But this preference does not make those explanations true. Conversely, accepting ancient accusations without critical examination risks perpetuating propaganda, risks seeing ancient Carthaginians not as they were, but as their enemies portrayed them, risks allowing victors' narratives to define our understanding of the vanquished. Imagine yourself, for a moment, as a Carthaginian parent in the 3rd century BCE. Your infant has died disease, perhaps, or complications of birth, or any of the countless causes that made infant mortality so common in your world. Your grief is profound and personal, but it must be expressed within the forms your culture provides. You take the small body to the sacred precinct, to the Tophet, where priests perform cremation rites. You commission a stone marker, inscribed with dedication to the gods, asking that they receive and protect your child. You place the urn containing ash and bone fragments in the designated ground, among hundreds of others, a community of loss stretching back generations. In this scenario, the Tophet is a place of mourning and memory, of attempting to make meaning from tragedy, of embedding individual grief within collective ritual. There is no sacrifice here, only the universal human response to death, shaped by particular cultural and religious forms. But now imagine differently. Imagine that your city faces existential threat, enemy armies approach, or plague ravages the population, or drought threatens famine. The priests declare that the gods are angry, that extraordinary measures are required to appease divine wrath. You are asked or commanded to give your child, to offer the most precious thing you possess as demonstration of devotion and desperation. The request violates every parental instinct, but refusal might mark you as impious, might bring social condemnation, might fail to avert collective catastrophe. In extremis, under circumstances of overwhelming crisis, you comply. In this scenario, the Tophet becomes a place of horror, of systematic violation of the parent-child bond, of religion twisted into something that demands the unbearable. The children buried here are not random victims of mortality, but deliberate offerings, their deaths purposeful rather than accidental. Which scenario is true? Perhaps both, at different times and in different contexts. Perhaps neither, and the reality was something else entirely, some practice or belief system that ancient sources misunderstood and modern interpreters cannot fully reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. The very uncertainty invites a kind of contemplative resignation. We peer across millennia, examining fragments and trying to reconstruct wholes, reading texts written by biased observers, applying modern analytical techniques to ancient remains, and still the past withholds its secrets. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain unresolved, reminding us that historical knowledge is always partial, always interpreted, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges or new theoretical frameworks develop. What we can say with confidence is that the Tophets existed, that they contain thousands of cremated infant remains, that they were sacred spaces connected to Carthaginian religion, and that they have generated intense debate precisely because they touch on fundamental human concerns: how societies treat children, how religion shapes behavior, how we judge cultures different from our own. The debate continues in academic journals and conferences, with scholars marshaling evidence and crafting arguments, with passions sometimes running high despite the ancient nature of the subject. New techniques, isotope analysis of bones, more sophisticated forensic aging methods, digital reconstruction of damaged inscriptions continue to add information, though each new piece of evidence seems to fuel controversy rather than resolve it. For us, in this moment, seeking not academic resolution, but gentle contemplation, perhaps the lesson lies not in determining definitive truth, but in acknowledging complexity. The past was not simple. Ancient peoples were not less human than we are, but they inhabited different mental and cultural worlds, operated from different assumptions, faced different constraints and possibilities. Whether Carthaginians sacrificed children or simply buried them with religious ceremony, they were people grappling with mortality, with the divine, with meaning and meaninglessness, with love and loss, and the terrible fragility of life. The Tophets, whatever their exact function, stand as testament to these universal struggles, to the ways humans across time and culture attempt to make sense of death, especially the death of the young, especially the death of potential unfulfilled. The stones still stand in some of these ancient sites, their inscriptions weathered but readable, their symbols still recognizable after more than 2,000 years. They mark places where people gathered in circumstances of grief or devotion, or both, where the boundary between human and divine seemed permeable, where the inexplicable could be offered to powers greater than human comprehension. Let the uncertainty be comforting rather than frustrating. Not everything need be known, not every question answered. The mystery of the Tophets joins countless other historical mysteries, practices forgotten, beliefs abandoned, entire civilizations reduced to ruins and debates. This is the nature of time, the inevitability of loss, the gradual fading of specificity into generality. Rest in the knowledge that these events, whatever their exact nature, are long finished. The children whose remains fill those urns have been gone for more than 2 millennia. The parents who mourned or offered them are equally vanished. The priests who performed ceremonies and carved inscriptions, the officials who maintained the sacred precincts, the society that created and sustained these practices, all have passed into history's vast archive. What remains are stones and bones, inscriptions and scholarly arguments, the persistent human desire to understand the past, even as the past recedes beyond complete understanding. And in that recession, in that ultimate unknowability, there is a kind of peace. The urgency drains away. The need to know yields to acceptance of mystery. And we, in our present moment, can observe these ancient controversies with detachment, acknowledging them without needing to resolve them, learning what we can and accepting what we cannot. The Tophet falls silent, as all ancient places ultimately fall silent. The debates continue among the living, but the dead keep their secrets, if secrets they have. And we move forward, through time and through this long night's journey, into Carthaginian civilization, toward the next segment, the next aspect of their world, always seeking understanding, while accepting that some things remain forever uncertain, forever debated, forever suspended between competing interpretations. We turn now to water, to the element that defined Carthage more completely than any other aspect of its civilization. While Rome built its identity on land, on legions marching dusty roads and farmers tilling soil, Carthage belonged to the sea. The Mediterranean was not a barrier separating Carthaginian territories, but a highway connecting them. Not an obstacle, but an opportunity. Not something to cross reluctantly, but to embrace fully as the foundation of power and prosperity. Imagine yourself approaching ancient Carthage from the sea, as thousands did over the centuries, merchants and sailors, diplomats and travelers, all arriving by ship, because that was how one reached Carthage, how one connected to its network, how one entered its sphere of influence. The city rises before you as your vessel draws closer to shore, its buildings climbing the slopes of the hills, its walls imposing, its temples visible even from a distance. But it is not the buildings that capture your attention first. It is the harbors. Carthage possessed perhaps the most sophisticated harbor complex in the ancient Mediterranean world. 2 harbors, one commercial and one military, connected to each other and to the sea by carefully engineered channels. The commercial harbor, rectangular in shape, served the merchant vessels that carried Carthage's trade, that brought grain and wine, metals and cloth, slaves and exotic goods from every corner of the known world. Yet remarkable as the commercial harbor was, it pales beside its companion, the military harbor, a circular coffin that represented the pinnacle of ancient naval architecture and engineering. Picture this harbor in your mind. Unlike natural anchorages or simple breakwaters, the military coffin was entirely artificial, dug and shaped by human labor, lined with stone, designed with precision for a specific purpose, the housing and rapid deployment of a war fleet. The harbor was circular, approximately 325 meters in diameter, with a narrow entrance channel that could be blocked by chains in times of danger, controlling access absolutely. At the center of the circle stood an island, also circular, connected to the shore by a bridge. Around both the outer ring and the central island, ship sheds were constructed covered slips where warships could be drawn out of water, protected from the elements, maintained and repaired. The sheds numbered 220, each capable of housing a single warship, each designed to allow rapid launching when the fleet needed to deploy. The engineering behind this construction is remarkable. The ship sheds required precise calculations of space and angle, ensuring that each vessel could be drawn up and launched without interfering with neighbors. Drainage systems prevented water accumulation that might rot timbers. The covered roofs protected ships from sun and rain, extending their operational lifespan. The entire complex represented a massive investment of resources, stone, timber, labor, engineering expertise, but it gave Carthage capabilities that few other powers could match. Standing at the harbor's edge, you would see these sheds extending around the circle, their openings like dark mouths facing the water, each sheltering a vessel of war. During periods of peace, only a fraction might be occupied. The fleet maintained at reduced strength. But in times of crisis, all 220 slips could be filled, representing a concentration of naval power that could dominate the Western Mediterranean. The ships themselves evolved over Carthage's history, but by the period of the Punic Wars, the standard warship was the quinquoreme, a vessel with 5 banks of oars. Or more accurately, 5 men to every vertical section of oars, arranged in a complex configuration that maximized rowing power while keeping the ship's beam manageable. Imagine yourself aboard such a vessel, not as a commander viewing strategy from the stern, but as an oarsman, one of 300 men whose synchronized effort propels this weapon of war across the sea. Your position is below deck, in the dim interior where light enters only through oar ports and hatches. The space is cramped, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, salt water, and the tar that waterproofs the ship's seams. Your oar is heavy, perhaps 5 meters long, its handle worn smooth by countless hands before yours. You sit on a simple bench, positioned so that your oar extends through a port in the ship's side, its blade designed to bite water efficiently. Above and below you, other oarsmen sit at their own oars, the arrangement staggered so that multiple banks can operate without interference. The rhythm of rowing becomes everything. A timekeeper, often a man with a drum or mallet, beats out the cadence. All 300 oarsmen must pull in unison, must apply force at exactly the same moment, must recover and prepare for the next stroke together. Any disruption of this rhythm, one man falling out of sync, one oar catching wrong cascades through the entire system, affecting the ship's speed and maneuverability. The work is exhausting. Rowing a warship at combat speed demands extraordinary physical effort sustained over periods that can stretch to hours. Your muscles burn, your hands blister and callous, your breath comes in gasps timed to the stroke. Sweat streams despite the sea breeze that occasionally reaches you through the oar ports. The monotony of the motion becomes almost meditative, your consciousness narrowing to this simple cycle: pull, recover, until thought itself seems to synchronize with the rhythm. Yet this collective effort, multiplied by 300 men, drives the quinquereme to speeds and maneuverability that sailing vessels cannot match. A warship under oar power can advance against the wind, can accelerate rapidly for ramming attacks, can maintain precise formation with other vessels in the fleet. This capability makes galleys the dominant naval weapon of the ancient Mediterranean, and Carthage's mastery of galley warfare makes it the dominant naval power for centuries. The quinquereme's primary weapon is the ram, a bronze-sheathed projection extending from the bow at the waterline. In battle, the ship drives this ram into enemy vessels, punching through wooden hulls, creating holes through which seawater pours. A successful ramming can sink an enemy ship within minutes, its crew scrambling to escape before the vessel capsizes or sinks beneath them. But ramming requires extraordinary skill. The attacking ship must build sufficient speed, must strike at the correct angle, must avoid getting its ram stuck in the enemy hull where it might be trapped. The oarsmen must respond instantly to commands: full speed, backwater, quarter turn, executing complex maneuvers while under the stress of combat, while enemy arrows and javelins rain down from above, while the consequences of failure include drowning in armor or being captured for slavery. Carthaginian crews trained extensively for these demands. Unlike merchant sailors who might go to sea occasionally between other occupations, naval crews were specialists, professionals who devoted themselves to mastering their craft. The city maintained a corps of experienced oarsmen and officers who formed the backbone of the fleet, supplemented during wartime by recruits and conscripts who learned through intensive drilling. The officers who commanded these vessels came from Carthage's elite families, men for whom naval command represented both duty and pathway to political influence. To successfully lead a warship required understanding of navigation, of weather, of tactics, of how to maintain discipline among a crew of 300, of when to fight and when to flee, of how to execute the admiral's orders while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. Consider navigation itself, the art of guiding a ship across open water to distant destinations. Carthaginian navigators could not rely on compasses or charts in the modern sense. Instead, they used accumulated knowledge passed from master to apprentice, generation to generation knowledge of currents and wind patterns, of how to read the stars and use them to maintain course at night, of landmarks and their appearance from various distances, of the color and movement of water that indicated shoals or depth changes. Coastal navigation, following shorelines from point to point, was relatively straightforward in the Mediterranean, with its many islands and peninsulas. But Carthaginian sailors ventured beyond coastal waters, crossed open seas where land disappeared below the horizon in all directions. They sailed to Sardinia and Sicily, to southern Spain, to the Atlantic coast beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. Some expeditions pushed even further into the unknown. Ancient sources preserve accounts of Carthaginian explorers who sailed down the African coast, establishing trading posts, encountering peoples and landscapes unlike anything in their Mediterranean experience. One account, attributed to a navigator named Hanno, describes a voyage that may have reached as far as the Gulf of Guinea, though modern scholars debate the text's authenticity and the expedition's actual extent. Another explorer, Himilco, supposedly sailed north along Europe's Atlantic coast, possibly reaching Britain in search of tin, a vital component of bronze alloy. These voyages, whether fully historical or partly legendary, reflect Carthage's maritime ambition, its willingness to venture beyond familiar waters in pursuit of trade and knowledge. The trade itself, the movement of goods that justified the existence of such an extensive merchant fleet, formed the lifeblood of Carthaginian prosperity. Ships departed Carthage laden with manufactured goods, purple-dyed textiles, pottery, metalwork, glass, and returned carrying raw materials and luxury items. Silver from Spanish mines, tin from distant northern regions, copper from Cyprus or Sardinia, grain from Sicily and North Africa, wine from Italy, slaves from countless sources, ivory and exotic animals from sub-Saharan Africa, amber from the Baltic, incense from the East. The scale of this trade was enormous. Hundreds of merchant vessels, ranging from small coastal traders to large grain ships, capable of carrying hundreds of tons, moved constantly through the Mediterranean and beyond. Carthage controlled crucial choke points, the Strait of Gibraltar, the waters around Sicily, ports along the North African coast, using its naval power to protect its own commerce, while occasionally interfering with competitors. This control was not absolute, nor was it exercised with consistent aggression. Carthage preferred profit to conflict, negotiation to war. Treaties with other powers divided spheres of influence, established rules for trade, created stability that benefited all parties. But when necessary, when commercial interests faced genuine threat, Carthaginian warships enforced the city's will, blockading ports, escorting merchant convoys, engaging enemy fleets in battles that determined which power would dominate which routes. The First Punic War, that prolonged conflict with Rome that ended in Carthaginian defeat, was fundamentally a naval war. Rome, traditionally a land power, built fleets to challenge Carthage at sea. The Romans, characteristically, approached the problem with determination and innovation. They captured a Carthaginian quinquereme that ran aground, studied its construction, and began building copies. Within months, Rome possessed a fleet. But building ships proved easier than sailing them. Early Roman fleets suffered disasters and storms because their crews lacked the seamanship that Carthaginians took for granted, the intuitive understanding of when to seek harbor, how to handle vessels in heavy weather, when conditions made sailing suicidal. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers and sailors drowned in these storms, their transports and warships overwhelmed by seas that Carthaginian sailors might have navigated successfully, or at minimum avoided entirely. Yet Rome persisted. Roman fleets engaged Carthaginian fleets in major battles, Mylae, Agnomus, Cape Hermium. The Romans innovated, adding boarding bridges called corvis to their ships, allowing Roman infantry to board enemy vessels and fight the kind of close combat at which they excelled. This tactic negated some of Carthaginian naval advantages, turning sea battles into something more like land battles fought on wooden platforms. The war's turning point came at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE. A Roman fleet intercepted Carthaginian ships carrying supplies to Carthage's forces in Sicily. The Carthaginian vessels, heavily laden with cargo and undermanned to make room for supplies, could not maneuver effectively. The Roman fleet, battle-ready and well-drilled after years of experience, won a decisive victory. Carthage, unable to supply its army in Sicily, unable to contest Roman naval supremacy, sued for peace. The loss of the First Punic War cost Carthage its fleet. peace terms limited the number of warships Carthage could maintain, effectively ending its naval dominance. The circular military harbor, those magnificent ship sheds capable of housing 220 vessels, stood increasingly empty. Carthage retained merchant shipping, continued to trade, but its ability to project power through naval force was broken. Imagine yourself, decades after that defeat, standing at the edge of the now quiet military harbor, where once the water churned with constant activity ships launching and returning, crews training, officers shouting commands. There is now stillness. Perhaps a dozen warships occupy the hundreds of empty sheds, a remnant fleet sufficient for coastal patrol, but incapable of challenging any major power. The maintenance workers still perform their duties, still repair the stone and timber, but the purpose feels hollow, the grand design reduced to managing decline. The merchant harbor remains active, of course. Trade continues because trade is what Carthage does, what defines its identity, even stripped of military power. Ships still arrive from Spain and Sicily, from eastern Mediterranean ports, from the African coast. Goods still flow through Carthaginian markets. Wealth still accumulates in the treasuries of merchant families. But the balance of power has shifted irrevocably. Rome now dominates, and Carthage exists at Rome's sufferance. The Second Punic War, Hannibal's great attempt to restore Carthaginian fortunes, was fought primarily on land precisely because Carthage no longer possessed the naval strength to challenge Rome at sea. Hannibal marched to Italy rather than sailing because the Mediterranean belonged to Rome. When the war ended in 201 BCE, the peace terms further restricted Carthaginian naval capacity. Only 10 ships, solely for coastal defense, not nearly enough to protect even Carthage's own trade routes effectively. The final humiliation came in 149 BCE, when the Third Punic War began. Rome, seeking to eliminate Carthage entirely, manufactured a pretext for war. When Carthaginian envoys arrived in Rome to negotiate, they were given impossible demands: surrender all weapons, then abandon the city itself and resettle inland, away from the sea. This last demand revealed everything about what Rome understood Carthage to be. A maritime city moved inland loses its reason for existence, becomes something fundamentally different, dies even if its people survive. The demand was calculated to be unacceptable, to force resistance that would justify total destruction. Carthage resisted. The siege lasted 3 years, the city defending itself with desperate determination. But in 146 BCE, Roman forces under Scipio Aemilianus' grandson, by adoption of the Scipio, who defeated Hannibal, breached the walls. What followed was systematic annihilation. The Romans killed or enslaved the population, razed the buildings, and according to tradition, plowed the site and sowed it with salt to ensure nothing would grow there again. The harbors, those magnificent engineering achievements, were destroyed. The circular military coffin, the covered ship sheds, the commercial port all were torn down or filled in. The maritime infrastructure that had made Carthage great was erased as thoroughly as Roman engineering could accomplish. But before that ending, before the flames and the slavery and the salt, there were centuries when Carthage ruled the waves, when its ships were the largest and fastest, when its navigators knew routes that others could not find, when its merchants grew wealthy trading goods across vast distances, when the circular harbor hummed with activity, and Carthaginian identity was inseparable from the sea. Think of the generations of sailors who learned their craft aboard, Carthaginian vessels who spent more of their lives on water than on land, who could read the sea's moods with the same ease that farmers read soil and sky. Their knowledge was practical, accumulated through experience rather than written in texts. Most of it died with them or passed into the traditions of other maritime peoples, absorbed and transformed until its Carthaginian origins were forgotten. Think of the ships themselves, thousands built over the centuries, each representing months or years of skilled labor shipwrights, shaping timbers, caulkers sealing seams, sailmakers weaving canvas. rope makers twisting fibers into cordage. Most of these vessels ended their service unremarkably, worn out by hard use, broken up for salvage, their timbers recycled into new ships or used for other purposes. A few sank in storms or battles, settling to the seafloor where over centuries they dissolved into scattered fragments that occasionally yield to archaeological investigation. The Mediterranean itself remains, of course, largely unchanged by human history. The same currents flow, the same winds blow from the same directions in the same seasons. The water is still blue under sun, gray under clouds, black at night. It still rises in storms and calms to glassy smoothness in certain conditions. Fish still move in schools through its depths. Salt still flavors the air along its coasts. But the ships that once crowded its surface are gone. The Carthaginian fleet exists now only in archaeological fragments, in ancient descriptions, in artistic depictions on coins and monuments, in the imagination of those who study maritime history. The quinquiremes and triremes, the merchant roundships and coastal traders, the fishing boats and ferries, all have dissolved into the past, leaving behind only memories and scholarly reconstructions. There is something peaceful in this dissolution, this gradual returning of human works to the elements from which they came. The intensity that drove Carthaginian sailors, the competition for trade, the fear of storms, the terror of battle, all of that urgency has dissipated completely. What remains is the gentle fact of their existence, the knowledge that they lived and worked and sailed, that they mastered a difficult craft, that they connected distant places, that they were essential to a civilization that rose and fell according to rhythms larger than any individual life. Rest in this knowledge. Let the image of the circular harbor settle into your mind, the stone slips, the dark interiors of the ship sheds, the water-reflecting sky, the narrow entrance opening to the broader sea beyond. Imagine it in various lights, dawn touching the eastern edge first, midday sun illuminating every detail, evening shadows lengthening across the water, night transforming everything into silhouettes and reflections of stars. The harbor is empty now, has been empty for 2,000 years. Time and conflict and the Mediterranean earth have reclaimed the site. Modern Tunis sprawls across where ancient Carthage stood. The circular coffin exists only in archaeological excavation, in ground-penetrating surveys, in the careful reconstruction of scholars, piecing together foundations and written descriptions to imagine what once was. But in imagination, in this quiet moment of contemplation, the harbor can live again, not frantically, not with the noise and urgency of its operational days, but calmly, as memory, as acknowledgement that humans once built something remarkable here, that maritime engineering reached heights that would not be surpassed for centuries, that a civilization defined itself through a relationship with the sea and achieved greatness before that greatness was taken away. The sea remains. It outlasts civilizations, absorbs their attempts at mastery, continues according to patterns established long before humans built ships, and will continue long after the last ship sails. There is comfort in this permanence, this indifference to human ambition. The Mediterranean does not mourn Carthage, does not remember Rome's triumph. It simply is, was, and will be vast, salt, governed by moon and wind and temperature gradients, home to countless forms of life, pathway and barrier, and resource and grave. Sleep comes like tide, gradual and inevitable, drawing you into depths where thought dissolves into rest, where the details of Carthaginian naval architecture and ancient maritime trade fade into the general rhythm of waves, where consciousness itself becomes as fluid as the element that defined the civilization we have explored. Let go of it all. Let the ships sail into darkness. Let the harbors empty and fill and empty again according to history's tides. Let the past be past, completed and unchangeable, available for contemplation, but demanding nothing, asking only that we remember it existed, that we acknowledge the lives lived and the works accomplished before allowing them to settle back into the silence from which we briefly called them forth. The journey through ancient Carthage approaches its end. One final passage remains a gentle conclusion that will gather together the threads we have followed, that will release you fully into sleep's embrace, that will mark the completion of this long night's exploration of a vanished world. But even before that formal ending, you can feel yourself drifting the boundaries, between segments blurring the specifics of harbors and ships, mixing with memories of streets and workshops of battles and controversies of lives lived millennia ago in circumstances both alien and familiar. Rest. The sea rocks you gently. The ancient ships sail on in imagination, their crews long since returned to Earth, their cargoes delivered or lost to storms, their purpose fulfilled or abandoned, their existence complete. And you, viewer of this distant past, need do nothing more than acknowledge their passage, honor their memory, and allow yourself to sink into the peaceful darkness that awaits all exploration's end.